So a few years ago, I actually presented at CABW to talk about some of SWAMP's efforts to support the use of physical habitat data, or PHAB data. We spoke about what we're doing to help improve data production and data quality. Marcus Segal actually gave a talk about what SWAMP is doing to improve data management, specifically told us about some of the tools that we're using to help calculate PHAB metrics and some of our data entry tools. And today I'm just going to talk about the third part of this effort, and that's improving the interpretation of physical habitat data. And in particular, I'm going to focus on developing an index that we can use to assess habitat condition. Now, why do we care about habitat quality? Well, if you've looked over any of the California Stream Condition Report from the Perennial Stream Assessment or the Southern California assessments, or actually if you heard Patty's talk yesterday, you would know that poor habitat condition is one of the most important stressors for benthic macroinvertebrates in streams in California and other parts of the country. It's actually implicated in a number of 303D listings, but we don't have an easy tool to take our PHAB data and just get a snapshot picture of whether or not that stream's in good condition. We don't have anything equivalent to like an IBI for physical habitat. And well, the reason why we don't have it is it's actually not quite so simple to produce. There's many key, you can't just throw your PHAB metrics into the grinder and come out with an index like you would for bugs or algae or diatoms. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's different about habitat data. This is actually something that Eric alluded to in his recent talk, but biological metrics, you can safely assume that these are a response to stress. If you alter the habitat, you alter the water chemistry, the biology will respond to that and reflect that kind of activity. It's really a measurement of condition. PHAB metrics, it's not always so straightforward. While there's some that actually do behave very similarly, for example, if you add sunlight to a stream by cutting down riparian vegetation or you add nutrients, you'll see the response in algae cover. There's a number of PHAB metrics that aren't really condition estimates, but really are direct measurements of stress, like all of our human influence measures. You wouldn't want to use these kinds of metrics in a condition indicator because that would conflate the stress and the response to that stress. There are several metrics that can be thought of as both a response as well as a stressor. And then there's a large number of metrics that aren't really classified as either, but nonetheless are really important to biology and habitat. And so you really have to know what kind of metric you're looking at before you start using it to assess the condition. Another important difference is that the range of metrics, the range of values that you observe at the metrics really differ. With most biological metrics, there's often a pretty clear distinction between what you observe at reference sites and at stressed sites. You see higher diversity, higher richness at your reference sites for biological metrics and lower diversity, lower richness at your stressed sites. But it's not uncommon to have the full range of values at your reference sites as well as your stressed sites. So you need to know a lot more about the context of your site in order to interpret what that metric is telling you. Another key difference is that biological metrics tend to respond in somewhat more predictable ways. Typically, you disturb the habitat, some metrics will go down, other metrics will go up, but they'll do that fairly consistently across sites and across stressors. Not so with habitat measures. This is an example of a stream in Orange County where there's a lot of water augmentation and urban runoff, and that's really blown out most of the fine sediments in this stream. This is the Garcia River in the north coast where over a century of logging practices has led to a lot of aggradation of sediment in the stream bed. So you have one metric showing two different types of responses in two different situations. Additionally, habitat metrics tend to respond a lot more independently than biological metrics do. When you stress a stream, the biological community tends to respond in concert, whereas you might have only certain aspects of the habitat affected. This photo is the San Gabriel River. It's the upper part of the river. It's an area heavily used by recreation, and you have hundreds of people coming over the weekend, altering the stream bed, building these little dams to create these swimming holes. It has a huge impact on the stream bed substrate, doesn't do much to the riparian corridor. Similarly, you have this is the San Mateo watershed in San Diego County. You have quite extensive impacts to the algae cover, but nothing really unusual with other aspects of the habitat. So you can't always assume that a stress will affect all aspects of the habitat. You have to have a much more concerted focus. So these are the kind of challenges that we have to deal with when we're trying to interpret our PHAB metrics and create an index. First, like I just alluded to, you have to know that the metrics you're looking at are meaningful. And in order to do this, you need to have a conceptual model of how a habitat functions. Second, you need to set appropriate expectations. And we're actually using a similar approach that we use for biological objectives, that is a reference-based approach. Then you need to know which metrics are working well for your assessment purposes. You need to know how they work with basic objective performance criteria. And this is, again, not quite as straightforward with habitat metrics as it is for biological metrics. And finally, you need to know how to combine these metrics into a single index. And like I'll talk about later, we have many different ways we could tackle this. So our conceptual framework for habitat, we're actually basing it on some of the groundwork that was done for the California Rapid Assessment Method, or CRAM. We identified some of the key thematic areas or some of the key functions that physical habitat is supposed to provide, and tried to connect the various PHAB metrics with each of these different areas. Here's just 6 examples and some key sample metrics in each. This conceptual model, it's something that we're constantly going back to and reiterating as our analyses allow to make sure that everything's still making sense. This is basically us applying the smell test every step of the way as we develop this index. For setting expectations, we want to know what kind of metric values should you see at ref sites in a similar environmental setting to your test site. And that's really a similar question to what we're asking with the biological indices. We're using the reference condition approach, and we're using statistical models to set these expectations, but we wanted to have more flexibility to allow for the more complicated responses habitat metrics have to stress. We decided to use some of the similar statistical approaches. We're using random forest models, and in particular, we're using a different flavor of random forest known as quantile random forest. The only difference you have to know is that it doesn't just tell you what's the expected value of your metric at your reference site, but it gives you an estimate of the range. So you can estimate different quantiles, like the 10th percentile or 90th percentile of reference sites. Let me just show you conceptually how we're thinking about this assessment method. So for any given metric at a site, you have one optimal value that you think is really the most typical of what you'd observe at reference sites. And the further your metric is from that expectation, the more confidence you have that that site's in a degraded condition. So for this metric, you're expecting to see 50% sands and fines, and if you have 95% sands and fines, the fact that you're now so much lower on the curve gives you some evidence that there's some degradation going on at that site. What's nice is that every different environmental setting, every test site you're looking at has its own curve. So you can have different expectations for 2 different sites. But even more importantly, you can have different types of responses at 2 different sites. So here you have one very narrow curve for a sensitive site, where really small differences in percent sands and fines can be detected as some kind of degradation. And then you have this broader curve for a more resilient site, where you need to have fairly major changes to the metric before you can consider that to be a degraded state. When I talk about environmental setting, I'm using some of the same concepts that we use for biological objectives. That is, we're looking for the environmental factors that we know have a major influence on habitat, or we suspect that, but aren't going to be influenced by human activity. These are factors related to location, geology, climate, watershed morphology. And we're also interested in exploring some locally measured, field measured factors like slope as well, because we do think that that'll be important. One of the key challenges in this approach is that you need a lot of data to calibrate your models. And specifically, you need a lot of reference data. And this is actually one of the more unfortunate steps of the process, is because we haven't been using our habitat protocols for as long. We don't have many sites that are reference quality sites with physical habitat data. It's quite a bit less than what we had for biological objectives development. And while this map says that we have 352 reference sites with PHAB data, for any given metric, just given the vagaries of sampling, it's actually quite a bit less. I would say most metrics, we end up with about 150 to 250 reference sites that we can use for modeling purposes. This really isn't going to be good enough for developing a tool for widespread use, but it is enough to get some sense about whether or not this approach will be feasible. I'm going to go through an example with some real data. This is Wilson Creek in the Tijuana watershed. This is down in San Diego. And our models predict that it'll have 44% sands and fines. It's not so unusual for Southern California. But we want to know how far from 44% should we be? Well, we can look at our models and say, okay, let's get a range. What's the 25th to 75th percentile? And you get a range of predictions going from 28 to 56%. You could even look at a broader range and use that to figure out maybe this is like, if this is a good condition, maybe you can get a fair condition estimate for a slightly broader range. And already you can see that we have this sort of asymmetrical response where increases in sands and fines are more problematic than decreases in sands and fines at this site. When you look at the observed value, we have 30%. That's within this good range, so we have confidence that this site is in good condition, which is great because this is actually a reference site. As you can see, different sites have different expectations. This is a North Coast site, and this is an Eastern Sierra site where you're expecting fairly low levels of sands and fines. These two sites in San Diego, you're expecting much higher levels. Note that at these sites, decreases in sands and fines aren't necessarily as important as at these sites. For evaluating the metrics, we are using the same framework that we use for biological objectives. We want to know that our models are accurate, that is, we have unbiased predictions at our reference sites, not affected by things like region or slope or other natural factors. We want to know that we have precise metrics, that is, we have fairly small prediction errors, and as well as highly repeatable measures. But there's also some nuances that we might need to use for assessing precision with this approach as well, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Sensitivity, we want to know that we can discriminate between reference and stress sites. And while this was, I would say, a minor challenge for the biological objectives, it's quite a bit more difficult for assessing habitat indices. Here's an example for looking at bias in our models due to in-canopy cover. Here's just the value of the raw metric at reference sites in different regions of the state. There might be some kind of counterintuitive things going on here, but it's actually like you have the lowest canopy cover in the Sierras where you have some of the wider streams, therefore you get more sunlight hitting the center of the channel. But you have pretty different metric values at different regions of the state. In contrast, when you look at your model and you look at the residuals, you see that they're actually fairly consistent across different regions. Maybe a slight positive bias, but overall, you're seeing the same range of expectations across different regions of the state. Therefore, you know that this approach will be much less biased in looking at the raw metric values. For precision, one thing that we might want to look at is what's the range of expectations we can consider to be good at any given site. Now, I walked you through this example. This is percent sands and fines. At every site, you're typically predicting a range of values of about 30 to 40%. So not great, but it's I guess, it's good enough to use for assessment. If you have 50% sands and fines, you know that it's bad at some sites, poor at others. So this is a range we can work with. In contrast, percent fast water habitat, this is basically things like riffles and cascades. This isn't going to be so useful. You know that you need to have somewhere between 25 and 100% fast water habitat to be in good condition at most sites. That's really not going to be useful for assessment unless you've completely eliminated all of your fast water habitat. I don't think we need a sophisticated model to tell us that that's probably a problem. But we do actually have some interesting site-specific effects. This metric here is channel widths, and you see fairly narrow range of expectations at most of our sites. But here's one site where you're expecting a range from about 2.5 to 15 or 16 meters. That's such a broad range that this metric probably isn't all that useful at that one specific site. So we might have different metrics that work better at some sites than others. Evaluating sensitivity. Well, this is sort of fake ideal data, but shows us, you get high scores at your reference sites, low scores at your stress sites. And the reason why I don't have real data to show you is because it's actually a pretty complicated task. I mentioned earlier that physical habitat metrics tend to have independent responses to stress. And so you can't just simply look at sites that have lots of development in their watershed and assume that every single habitat metric will reflect that. You need to have a more sophisticated approach, probably something involving best professional judgment in selecting which sites should be impacted for which stressor. This is actually one of our most important remaining tasks at this point. In terms of combining habitat metrics into an MMI, there are a number of different approaches, but I do want to stress that I feel like there is value in looking at individual metrics here, more so than what you would have looking at individual bioassessment metrics. if you're interested in, for example, the effects of some sort of watershed activity on sands and fines, why not just look at that single metric independently? However, I do think that there is value in combining these into an index to get a bit more of a broad picture about what's going on with the habitat. There are many different ways we can do this. The holistic method is what I think probably most of us are thinking of when we want a habitat condition index. We want to have a variety of metrics that reflect different thematic areas or different components of habitat function into a single index. But we could also develop indices focusing on each of these different thematic areas separately, and this is probably more comparable to what CRAM does with its different attributes. We could take a performance-based approach where we're simply trying to select the metrics that provide us with the most clear signal of stress. That is, we were trying to build a canary to tell us as soon as, to be sensitive to any kind of disturbance in the habitat, the little canary in the coal mine. We could try to develop an index that's really calibrated towards detecting the effects of specific stressors. I know Dave Herbst has done something similar for detecting grazing effects in the Sierras, and we could take this approach to all sorts of different types of stressors. And finally, we could try to calibrate an index that is most finely tuned to which metrics have the greatest influence on biology. For example, we could have one for benthic macroinvertebrates and another for diatoms. So there is a lot of variety of approaches we could use, and we could take any or all of the above. So what's next? Like I mentioned, we need more reference data. Fortunately, as our sampling programs continue, the reference condition program and the probability programs tend to gather quite a few reference sites, and that will help improve these models as we move down the road. I think we need to think a bit more carefully about how we're going to validate these models, particularly with regard to identifying stressed sites to know whether or not our indices are sensitive. And finally, and this is something I'd actually probably like to get some idea from the group here, is what kinds of approaches will be you guys would be most interested in for creating a multimetric index. And with that, I'd just like to open it up to questions and just thank all the people who helped develop the PHAB metric calculations and also collect all the data that we used for index development. Thanks.
I just had a short question. If you're working in the Central Valley and there's no reference sites, what other areas or elevations or other parts of the state could you use as a reference?
What other parts of the state do we use as reference specifically for the Central Valley?
Yeah, if you're restoring Central Valley creeks, is there?
I think this is a major challenge for biological assessment, but I think it's probably well, it might actually in some ways be easier for the Central Valley in terms of there might be better sources of data we could use from historical sources for reconstructing what the physical habitat of a stream looked like, because people were paying more attention to that than they were to the insects or diatoms in the streams, back in the 19th century. So I think we could explore historic ecology options more effectively for the Central Valley. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
What if there are no good reference sites in an area, not in like a specific region, but since we're talking about bioassessment in California at this conference, what if there's no reference sites in California? Can we use it from another state that has a similar ecosystem?
Well, okay, so one of the things that we're trying to do with the reference condition approach is you're not always trying to compare your site to one specific reference site that matches it, but you're trying to look at the whole range of reference that's available out there, and that really helps you capture all the different sources of natural variability. And we know we're going to have an easier time for some stream types than others. For example, the high gradient, high elevation streams in the Sierras, we have lots of reference sites for that. Lower elevation streams, it's going to be a bigger challenge, particularly under certain climates and latitudes of the state. We do have some data available to us from outside the state, and like from Oregon and from other parts of national stream assessments, I think it's going to be a bigger challenge on the more arid end of things where there hasn't been as much sampling, say, in regions, drier than San Diego, for example. So.
Thank you.